Unit 13, Evolution, Development and Function of Capitalism. Contents: 13.1 Introduction, 13.2 Historical Interpretation of Capitalism, 13.3 Development and Function of Capitalism, 13.4 Commodity Production and Capitalistic Production, 13.5 Expansion of Markets and Production, 13.6 Monopoly Capitalism and Imperialism, 13.7 Conclusion, 13.8 Further reading. Learning objective: this unit is aimed at contributing towards an understanding of the evolution, development and function of capitalism. Also provide different theoretical standpoints on capitalism through historical writing. 13.1 Introduction. Capitalism was used by economists in a purely technical sense to refer to the use of methods of production and has been largely associated with a particular view of the nature of capital. This definition of capitalism has no reference to the way in which the instruments of production are owned. It refers only to their economic origin and the extent of their use. According to another conception, capitalism is identified with a system of unfettered individual enterprise. That is, a system where economic and social relations are ruled by contract, where men are free agents in seeking their livelihood, and where legal compulsions and restrictions are absent. Thereby, capitalism is made virtually synonymous with a regime of laissez-faire or free competition. 13.2 Historical Interpretation of Capitalism. Broadly speaking, historical research and historical interpretation have influenced three separate meanings assigned to the notion of capitalism. A. Capitalism as a spirit of enterprise. This idea has been popularized by the writing of Werner Sombart. He has sought the essence of capitalism not in any one aspect of its economic anatomy or its physiology, but in the totality of those aspects as represented in the geist or spirit that inspired the life of a whole epoch. This spirit is a synthesis of the spirit of enterprise or adventure with the bourgeois spirit of calculation and rationality. Believing that at different times different economic attitudes have always reigned, and that is this point spirit which has created the suitable form for itself and thereby an economic organization. Thus he traced the origin of capitalism in the development of states of mind, and hence human behavior is conducive to the existence of those economic forms and relationships which are characteristic of the modern world. The pre-capitalistic man was a neutral man who conceived economic activity as simply catering to his natural wants, and in pre-capitalistic times, at the center of all effort and all care stood living man. He is the he is the measure of all the things. By contrast, the capitalistic turned topsy-turvy the natural man, his primitive and original outlook and all the values of life, and saw the amassing of capital as the dominant motive of economic activity, and in an attitude of sober rationality and by the methods of precise quantitative calculation subordinated everything in life to this end. More simply, Max Weber defined capitalism as present wherever the industrial provision for the needs of a human group is carried out by the method of enterprise. Weber used a spirit of capitalism to describe that attitude which seeks profit rationally and systematically. B. Capitalism as a commercial system. This is the meaning more often found implicit in the treatment of historical material than explicitly formulated. This notion virtually identifies capitalism with the organization of production for a distant market. However, the regime of the early craft guild, where the craftsman sold his products retail in the town's market, would presumably be excluded by this definition. Capitalism could be regarded as being present as soon as the acts of production and retail sale came to be separated in space and time by the intervention of a wholesale merchant. This merchant advanced money for the purchase of wares with the object of subsequent sales at a profit. To a large extent, this notion is a linear descent of the scheme of development employed by the German historical school. With its primary distinctive definition, the natural economy of medieval world and the money economy that succeeded it. Money economy emphasizes that the market defined the stages in the growth of the modern economic world. In the words of Butcher, the essential criterion is the relation which exists between the production and consumption of goods. To be more precise, the length of the route with which the goods traversed in passing from producers to consumers. This is not uncommonly found in close conjunction with a definition of capitalism, a system of economic activity that is dominated by a certain type of motive or profit motive. The existence in any period of a substantial number of persons who rely on the investment of money with the objective of deriving an income, whether this investment be in trade or in usury in production, being taken as evident of the existence of an element of capitalism. Professor Nausabaum defines capitalism as a system of exchange economy in which the orienting principle of economic activity is unrestricted profit, to which he adds an additional characteristic, saying such a system is marked by a differentiation of population into owners and propertyless workers. Capitalism is a particular mode of production. We have the meaning originally given by Marx, who sought the essence of capitalism neither in a spirit of enterprises nor in the use of money to finance a series of exchange transactions with the object of gain, but in a particular mode of production. By mode of production, he did not refer merely to the state of technique that he termed as the state of productive forces, but to the way in which the means of production were owned and to the social relations between men which resulted from their connections with the process of production. Thus, capitalism was not simply a system of production for the market, but a system of commodity of production, is as Marx termed it. And also it is a system under which the labor power had in itself become a commodity and was bought and sold on the market like any other object of exchange. The historical prerequisite of capitalism was the concentration of ownership of the means of production in the hands of a class, consisting of only a minor section of society. As a consequence of this, a large-scale property-less class emerges, from whom the sale of their labor power was their only source of livelihood. According to productive activity was accomplished by the propertyless class not by virtue of legal compulsion but on the basis of wage contract. It is clear that such a definition excludes the system of independent handicraft production, where the craftsman owned his own property implements of production and undertook the sale of his own wares. However, here there was no divorce between the ownership and work, and except where he relied to any extent on the employment of journeymen, it was the purchase and sale of inanimate wares, not of human labor power, that was his primary concern. What differentiated the use of this definition from other is that the existence of trade and of money lending and the presence of a specialized class of merchants and financiers. Even though they may be men of substance, it does not suffice to constitute a capitalist society. Men of capital, however acquisitive, are not enough. Their capital must be used to yoke labor to the creation of surplus value in production. D. Reflections on the origin of capitalism. Both Sombart's conception of the capitalistic spirit and a conception of capitalism as a commercial system share in common certain lacunae. This conception focus acquisitive investment of money. These conceptions are insufficiently restrictive to confine the term to any one epoch of history, and that they seem to lead inexorably to the conclusion that nearly all periods of history have been capitalistic, at least in some degree. The further definition attached to the idealistic conception of Sombart and Weber and their school that if capitalism as an economic form is the creation of capitalist spirit, the genesis of the latter must first of all be accounted for before the origin of capitalism can be explained. If this capitalistic spirit is itself a historical product, what caused its appearance on the historical stage? To this riddle, no satisfactory answer has been propounded to date other than the accidental coincidence in times of various states of mind. Box 13.1 Protestantism and Capitalism. The search of a cause has led to the unsatisfactory and inconclusive debate as to whether it is true that Protestantism gave rise to the capitalistic spirit as Weber and Tolch has claimed. There seems to be scarcely more reason to regard capitalism as the child of the Reformation than to hold with somewhat what it was largely the creation of the Jews. However, if the emergence of new economic system is to be explained in terms of an idea, this idea must embody in its embryo the essence of the future system in advance, which has to be explained. On the other hand, the definition of capitalism in actual use in historiography has moved increasingly towards that which was first adopted and developed by Marx. Emphasis has increasingly come to be placed on the emergence of a newer type of class differentiation between capitalist and proletariat rather than on profit as a motive or economic activity, and attention has increasingly been focused upon the appearance of a relationship between the producer and capitalist, analogous to the employment relation between the master and the wage earner in the fully mature industrial system of the 19th century. On the all this is because the material which research has disclosed has forced this emphasis upon the attention of historians in their search for the essential differentiation of modern age. Then because they have been predisposed towards it by the writing of Marx. Thus Mr. Lipson in claiming that the essentials of capitalism were present some centuries before the Industrial Revolution states that the fundamental features of capitalism is the wage system under which the worker has no right of ownership in the wares which he manufactures. The worker sells not the fruits of his labor but the labor itself, a distinction which is of vital economic significance. 13.3 Development and function of capitalism. First, stages of capitalism. The development of capitalism falls into a number of stages characterized by different levels of maturity. Each of them is recognizable by fairly distinctive traits only when we seek to trace the stages and to select one of them as making the opening stage of capitalism. If we are speaking capitalism as a specific mode of production, then it follows that we cannot date the dawn of this system from the first signs of the appearance of large-scale trading and a merchant class, and we cannot speak of a special period of merchant capitalism. We must look for the opening for the capitalistic period only when changes in the mode of production occurs in the sense of a direct subordination of the production to a capitalistic. This is not just a point of terminology but of substance. The main work of Marx carries the title Capital. Marx spent many years of his life on the analysis of capitalism because he was convinced that a thorough theoretical understanding was needed in order to facilitate the practical critique of capitalism, its overthrow by the proletariat. As the subtitles puts it, Capital is a critique of political economy. Political economy stands for the economic theory developed by the classical bourgeois economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Marx studied their theories in minute details, starting their theories and subjecting their categories such as value, commodity, money, capital, etc. to a sharp critical analysis. Marx proceeds to expose the true nature of capitalism. In the process, he breaks down the powerful scientific legitimation of capitalistic economy and not only provides a new scientific model for the analysis of capital, but lays the foundation for a fundamental critique of the totality of capitalism. B. Political economy of capitalism. There are two ways to study capitalism and to get to know its specific character, and both ways we need in order to get a full understanding. The first way is to study how it was born, how it's developed, under which circumstances, and with what results. This requires a study not only of the economic process but the development of the whole Bush's society. It is wide field. It's a wide field. It is wide field as each country has its own history in this aspect. But such studies presuppose the second way to study capitalism, namely by systematic analysis of the economic structure of capitalistic society. In that case, one has to start not from the historical origins but from the capitalist system as a totality. That is the approach which Marx follows in Capital. Box 13.2 Dialectical Logic. History once would have to begin with agriculture and the category of ground rent. By taking capital as starting point and finishing point, Marx follows the path of dialectical logic. This method presupposes the concrete totality of the system, but for the sake of analysis, it takes one part after the other till it is able to conceive and present whole aspects, how all relations, all categories functions as part of totality. Marx calls is the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete. The isolated part may look real and concrete, but it is an abstraction from the more complex reality. It is the rich totality of many determinations and relations which forms the concrete reality. Capital is constructed according to this dialectical logic. Volume 1 is devoted to the analysis of the process of production of capital. We can neither discuss all the theories forwarded by Marx in Capital, nor can we go into the specifics of the historical development of capitalism. We can only highlight in some of the main theoretical statements and refer to some of the main aspects of the historical process. 13.4 Commodity production and capitalistic production. A first characteristic of capitalistic economy is that it is form of commodity production. It is production for sale, production for the market. That is why Marx started his analysis of capitalist mode of production with the analysis of commodities. But not all commodity production is already capitalistic production. Commodity production emerged thousands of years back in human history, whereas capitalism is only a few hundred years old. The primitive society, all production is for direct use. There is no production for exchange on the market. Production of commodities of goods for exchange developed slowly. For a long time, it plays only a subordinate role. Only in the capitalistic society, commodity production becomes the completely dominant form of production. It becomes generalized. Reflection and action 13.1. Commodity production a recent phenomenon. Commodity production is a recent phenomenon. Give some of its characteristics. Analyzing the mode of simple commodity production, Marx characteristic the purpose as the sell in order to buy. The peasant wants to sell some grains in order to buy a grain. The weaver comes to sell some cloth in order to buy grain. The operation can be presented as CMC, that is commodity, money, commodity. One sells one commodity in order to buy another commodity. Money is a mean of exchange just to make the transaction easier. The value of the two commodities of C and C is the same, is equivalent. However, on the marketplace, we find not only the peasant and the artisans, but also the merchant. His economic operation is a different one. He buys in order to sell. He comes to the market not with the commodities but with money. With that money, he buys some product in order to sell it a higher price. This operation can be presented as MCM, that is money, commodity, money with the increased value. This money which has been increased by a surplus value is called capital. Capital has been there long before capitalism in the form of merchant capital or unuser capital, money lender capital. The difference is that these forms of capital derive their profit from their role in the exchange of commodities in the sphere of distribution or circulation of market. The user and the merchant appropriate part of the surplus value which has been produced, but they don't control the production itself. The capitalist mode of production comes into being when capital moves into one spheres of production, when it gets hold of the means of production and start controlling and directing production itself. This is a long historical process which start in a medieval Europe. Its basic characteristics are the separation of the producer from his means of production, the concretization of the means of production in the hands of one class, the bourgeois, the formulation of another class which has no means of substance other than the sale of its labor power, the proletariat. The capitalist production is impossible as long as the producers still own or control the means of production. As long as an artisan, a weaver, or a carpenter has his own tools and workshop, he will not voluntarily go and sell his labor power and start working in a factory. As long as a peasant possesses some land, he will prefer to work on it rather than get hired as a labor. Capitalistic production needs workers, people who sell their labor power. Therefore, it needs the separation of producers and means of production, so that the producers are forced by economic compulsion to sell their labor power. The separation has taken place in various ways, usually in a very brutal and bloody manner. In actual history, it is notorious that the conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force played the greater part. Marx has documented this for England in Capital 1, Part 8, Chapter 26, showing that the so-called primitive accumulation is nothing else than the historical proceeding of divorcing the producer from the means of production. The result of this process of separation is the formation of two classes which form the two poles of capitalist society. On the one side, we find the bourgeois as the class of owners in whose hand the means of production are concentrated. On the other hand, we find that proletariat as the class which has to find its substance by the sale of its labor power. Bourgeoisie and the proletariat are the basic classes of capitalistic society, but not necessarily the only ones. Other classes such as intermediate sections in the various combinations may exist, but capitalism is possible only if there is a class of owners on one hand and a class of non-owners on the other hand. Secondly, it is the relationship to the means of production which characteristic these classes: ownership, control, and non-ownership. It is not simply a question of rich or poor. Not at all. Not all poor people are workers. They may be petty artisans or hawkers or peasants who still own some piece of land. An industrial worker may earn more and yet he is a member of the working class, whereas the poor peasant owner is not. The working class is not homogeneous. It consists of various sections, skilled and unskilled, on daily wages or on monthly wages, under the poverty line and the above it. All unites them is that they are all forced to sell their labor power to be it's under different categorizations. A working class crosses the borderline of the working class only when his salary allows him to set up his own shop, to become a petty money lender, or to start living or renting out houses, etc. 13.5 Expansion of markets and production. A further precondition for the development of capitalism is the expansion of market. The pre-capitalistic small-scale commodity production works for a limited market. In the 16th century, a commercial revolution took place in Europe. Discoveries of new trade routes opened in the Vasco da Gama era of worldwide trade under colonial condition. The expansion of the market encouraged large-scale production and thus the growth of capitalism. The capitalistic entrepreneurs can emerge only when a certain scale of production has been reached. The guide master and his limited number of journeymen and apprentices do not produce enough for setting the master free to do only the directing and supervising work. The capitalist as a director of the enterprises emerges with the scale of production growing system. The production of surplus value. with the market of the commodity production expanding and with the minimum of capital in the hands of class of owners of the means of production, and with a sufficient number of workers ready to be hired on the labor market, capitalist production can develop. Once it has gathered momentum, it has its own internal dynamism to expand further and further. Marx calls in the relentless, restless, never-ending process of profit making. How does it work? The key answer of Marx is his theory of the production of surplus value. Box number 13.3, the capitalistic entrepreneur. Capital is formed when money cases to be only a means of exchange which facilitates the exchange of commodities, and when the increase of money adding new value, because the aim of economic transaction, the user and the merchant try to achieve this in the sphere of market. The capitalistic entrepreneur does it by subordinating the process of production itself to this process. He buys raw material, means of labor, etc., and buys labor power. The laborers are paid for the use for the consumption of their labor power by wages. The owner of the means of production appropriates these higher products. After selling them, he has made a profit. Where does this additional money comes from? Has money the power to create more money? Is it the shrewdness of the capitalistic? Of course, occasionally there may be a windfall through a shrewd operations, but that does not explain the general process of profit making. There are occasional setbacks as well as various reasons. Marx finds the course of profit hidden in one particular commodity which the participant buys the market. The commodity is labor power. For Marx, and the extraction of unpaid surplus labor is the key to understand the different forms of society. Rent paid to the landlord in feudal society, taxes paid to the state in Asiatic society. These forms are connected with the different political structures need to be enforced. This extraction in capitalistic society and the appropriation of surplus value happens in a new way. It is no longer the unpaid labor of slavers or serfs, but the unpaid labor of wage laborers. Workers in capitalist societies receive wages. It seems they are paid for their work. That is the reason mystification of capitalism, which covers up the process of exploitation. Actually, they are paid not for their own but for the use of their labor power. What they produce is more than their wages. The wages come only when the cost of unnecessary labor, what is needed to maintain the labor, the value of what he produces is more than that. The capitalist appropriate the difference, which is the surplus. This is possible because labor power is a commodity which can be brought on the market. B. The never-ending process of profit making. Capitalist tries to increase the rate of surplus value all the time. Now we raise the questions why the capitalist has to be involved in such a relentless manner in profit making. This can be attributed to the unlimited greed which is fostered by capitalism. Thus, this greed should not be understood in monopolistic manner, but as capitalistic. The process of accumulating capital will continue, otherwise they go bankrupt. This pressure comes from the competition between the individual capitalistic, which is characteristics of capitalism. If a capitalist does not invest in a new technology, if he does not expand production, other will move ahead and conquer the market, and he will be left out in the world cold. He cannot appropriate profit for his own consumption only or spend it just for some unproductive processes. He must take a part of it and put it aside for reinvestment. That part becomes new additional capital. Thus, he has to accumulate capital. This implies the trend towards the concentration of capital in large scale production. This concentration again becomes the basics of the centralization of the ownership and control of capital in the hands of few. Reflection to 13.2. What is the role of new technology is capitalist production? Does it alternate ownership and control capital? What is the role of a new technology in capitalist production? Does it alter ownership and control of capital? The market is like a jungle with its law of survival of the fittest. The general tendency is towards the elimination of the smaller one to the centralization of capital. The bigger capitalistic grows bigger and fewer. Then now consider what effect the law of accumulation of capital has on labor. Accumulation of capital means an increased demand for the labor power. This could lead to rise in the price of labor. On a modest scale, wages may rise for a while, but this does not change the basic position of labor, who is completely dependent on the capitalist. Capitalism does not only create demand for labor, it also creates unemployment through the process of mechanization. In this way, it creates an industrial reserve army of unemployed whom existence become it possible for the capitalistic to keep the way of wages of the employed under control. The answer of the law of supply and demand of labor on his basics completes the despotism of capital. There is another reason why the capitalistic has to expand production unlimited. In the process of accumulation of capital, the proportion of constant capital increases and become greater in relation to variable capital. This is called the growth of the in the organic composition capital. Since the constant capital increases in the process of mechanization and the part of surplus value, process variable capitals become relatively less, and Marx assume a tendency of the average rate of profit to decline. The more a capitalistic expands, the lower his rate of profit becomes. He can only make good for it by expanding the value scale of production. But the ever-increasing expansion of capitalistic production leads to inevitably to an economic crisis. That is the other way of capitalistic which Marx establishes. These crises are the result of the basic contradiction between capital and labor. In order to survive, capital must accumulate and expand. For its expansion, mass production, it must find masses of buyers. These mass cannot, to a large extent of workers, they can only buy it by receiving different higher wages, but higher wages reduce the capitalistic rate of profit. Every individual capitalistic therefore would like to keep his own workers poor and to see the rest of the workers rich enough to buy his products. 13.6 Monopoly, Capitalism and Imperialism. The dynamism of capitalism, the permanent pressure to accumulate capital leads to a large in the character of capitalist economy. There are of free competition brought about a tremendous expansion of productive forces and of production on a mass scale. But this led to simultaneously to the concentration and centralization of capital, and thus to a new situation in which an increasing number of big companies or groups of companies are able to conquer monopoly position in the market. Monopoly capitalism developed through cartels, trusts, holdings and fusions. Capitalists move to protect the rate of profit against the effect of free competition. Once the market is under monopoly control, higher profits can be achieved by limiting product instead of increasing it, by holding back technological improvement instead of introducing them, by lowering the quality of products instead of raising it. Marx foresaw the rights of monopolies as the result of concentration of capital, but monopoly capitalistic become the dominant only after Marx's death. Several Marxists tried to provide a theoretical framework for the analysis of this new phase of capitalism. The Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding published his study Financial Capital, the latest process of capitalistic development, in 1910. The Polish-German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg came out with her study The Accumulation of Capital, 1930. The Russian Marxist and Bukharin finished his Imperialism and World Economy, 1915, and Lenin completed his Imperialization, the highest value of capitalism, in 1916. Lenin made use both of Hilferding and Bukharin, though he offered on certain points with them. For example, he did not agree with the Hilferding that the monopolization would eliminate all free competitions within a national economy. Box 13.4 Basic features of imperialism. The concentration of production of and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which plays a decisive role in economic life. The merging of bank capital and industrial capital and the creation on the basis of this financial capital of financial oligarchy. The export of capitalism as a distinguished form of export of commodities acquire exceptional importance. The formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves, and the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalistic powers is compelled. The formation of international monopolistic capital. This is the balance of the last paragraph. 13.7 Conclusion. The origins of and development of capitalism has been traced and understood by various social thinkers based on different parameters. However, Marx's understanding of capitalism has influenced greatly than any other theories. The main argument by Marx is that the feudal mode of production has been replaced by capitalistic mode of production, and under capitalistic some society is divided into main antagonistic classes: the classes of capitalists of the bourgeoisie and the case of proletariat. The main economic law and the stimulus of the capitalistic mode of production is the creation of surplus value by workers and its appropriation. The unpaid labor of wage worker is the source of surplus value. Further reading, we have books like Studies in the Development of Capitalism and Modern Social Theory by Anthony Giddens and McLean David in 1975, The Thought of Karl Marx, Macmillan. So this is the end of the chapter 13.